There are a list of names in our bulletin of people who have passed on this year. For many of you, these are just names. For others of you, they are family. They are friends. For me, it's a hodgepodge. I have fished with some of these people. I have danced with them. I have partied with them. I have cried with them. I have listened to their stories. Let me read these names to you. There's Daisy Hughes, Dick Young, Dr. Bill Jackson, Dr. Elaine Anderson, Alberta Weisner, Estelle Delo, Forrest Williams, Jean Freeberg, Jean Murphy, Geraldine Lambright, Hazel, my friend Gibby Gilbertson. And when I see her name, I remember how much care the Stevens over here have given to her. James Rex Hartfield, Joe Cover, my neighbor Kay Burrell, Lois Allen, Mary Ann Mock, Mona Allen, Paul Myers, Paul Vernon, Pearl Stenke, Robert Glover, and one person who got left off the list, Nancy Finch. Let us pray. Our Father, these are more than names that we have just read. They are people who have worshiped here, some for many, many years, some for just a short while. Some have remembered the church in their will. Some have prepared food for the homeless. Some have sang in the choir. There's a whole variety of gifts and graces that have been given to our church through these people. And as we worship today, we do so with the understanding that we stand on their shoulders. We stand in appreciation of all that they have contributed, for all that they have brought to the table as we worship. And so we would uphold their names, thanking you for them. There's another list of names in the bulletin of our members who are presently ill, who are homebound. And we would ask that you would watch over those people as well. For all the care and the love that you have shown this congregation, accept our thanksgiving. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. I'm so glad you're here this morning. And I want to share with you some history. But I do that with the understanding that people don't go to church for a history lesson. And so part of me wants to apologize for that. The other part is we all have roots. We all have a cultural heritage, which makes us a Methodist church. So I really wanted to share that with you, and for the reasons I will tell you at the end. And this is the first of a series of 3 series on Then Came the Wesleys. Some of you weren't here in previous weeks, so I want to do a very quick review of some histories, which is the world that the Wesleys inherited. I began with King Henry VIII, that you have all heard of King Henry VIII. And King Henry VIII split with the Roman Catholic Church. And it really wasn't for theological reasons. It was that he wanted a different wife because he needed a male heir. And in the process, he also learned that in the year 1066, when William the Conqueror took over England, that he gave approximately a third of the land of England to the church. So when Henry was debating whether he should split from the church, he learned that, wow, I can acquire a third of the land, and I can buy a lot of friendship with that. And my point with that is, for all of us, when we make decisions, our decisions are rarely singular of motive. We generally do things for mixed motives, for many motives, and our motives are never as pure as we would like to think. So Henry splits from the church, and then when he dies, his daughter takes over, and his daughter is the daughter of his first wife, Catherine. And that daughter's name is Mary, and she's Catholic. So she declares all of England to now be Catholic. And she passes away, and the next daughter takes over, and that's the daughter of the second wife, named Elizabeth, and she's Protestant, and she declares everybody to be Protestant. At the same time, Bibles are starting to come into the area. And people are reading the Bible, they are looking at the church, they are looking at the government pronouncement of the church, of what people ought to be, and they say this is nonsense. And about 20% of the clergymen leave the church. And they are joined by a variety of people who are reading the scriptures. And there's kind of no denominational lines, but these people eventually form into a variety of groups. One group call themselves Baptist. And the Baptists, many of them are getting slaughtered. Now, they're not getting slaughtered because of heresy, which is a theological term. They're getting slaughtered because if you disagree with the church, you are disagreeing with the government, and if you are disagreeing with government, that's treason. A very significant event. And then there's a big, what I call, women's movement. There's another group of people in the north of England who fall in love with the Old Testament, who begin, the clergymen studying the language, they're studying both Hebrew and Greek, very scholarly group, and they decide, because the women are pushing them, we have to get out of town. We don't want to get killed because of our beliefs. And so some of them move to Scotland, some of them move to Ireland, and a group of them go across the North Sea the other way to Amsterdam. And when they're in Amsterdam, they begin to realize, we're English, we're not Dutch. Wouldn't it be nice if we could form our own little city, our own little town? We could take the scriptures and begin to form a Christian community. Do you think we could do that? And the dream becomes stronger and stronger. So they leave Amsterdam and sail to the Boston area, and we know them as the Pilgrims and the Puritans. They establish Boston. They then move over, and they eventually, pushing time forward, they establish Boston, Buffalo, Cleveland, Chicago, San Francisco, and Seattle. Those are all Puritan established communities. There's another group of people who are reading the Bible who couldn't care less about the Old Testament. They're into the New Testament, and they don't like all the theology of it. They like the spirit of it. So they meet and read a little of the New Testament, and then they spend a lot of time in quietness, and they ask themselves, what is the Spirit of the Lord saying to us today? And those people are known as the Quakers. The Quakers leave North England, the town of Hull, and they come around England. They sail to the colonies at that point, up the Delaware River, and they settle in Delaware and West Jersey. And then King Charles takes this woodland, and the name for woodland is Sylvania, and gives Sylvania 660,000 square miles. They don't know how far the colonies go in, so he designates 660,000 square miles of Sylvania and gives it to his friend William. And William's last name is Penn. So Penn owns Sylvania, and that's where we get Pennsylvania, and that is sold only to Quakers. So the Quakers own Pennsylvania, Delaware, West Jersey. The king also gives much of Virginia to retired military people that have been very helpful to him. And then south of that, from Virginia to Florida, is called the Carolinas. Carolina means nothing about North Carolina or South Carolina. It simply means what happened during the reign of Charles. Now, it's into that context that Wesley comes. Our pastor said that Wesley came from a family of 17. I will tell you it came from 19, but so be the numbers, right? The issue is, and the problem is, most of Wesley's children didn't live that long. So there are only about 9 or 10 of them. The significant part is Wesley's father is a pastor and a poet. But I think the real influence was from his mama. His mama is the educator in the family, and his mother speaks fluent English, Latin, Greek, and French. And she's the one that sets the kids up on a learning schedule. Very rigid learning schedule. You know, at 8 o'clock you do this, at 9 o'clock you do that. You know, you study Latin for so long, you study French so long, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And she works with the children, and the children qualify to then go to Oxford. Wesley goes to Oxford, and there is a group of Oxford students that meet. Nothing more than if a group of students from St. Pete College met for a Bible study, prayer, and then later they add service where they help the poor. It's just a bunch of guys. He becomes one of these bunch of guys. The other thing that has happened up till this point is all of the clergy, beginning in about 1640 up through the 1700s, all of the theology that they write can be classified under the term moralism. Moralism is this: if you work hard enough, if you read your Bible long enough, if you pray enough, if you service enough, if you do the right things long enough, eventually God will love you. And that has a tremendous effect on Oxford University. It has a tremendous effect on John Wesley. John Wesley then becomes a missionary, goes to the colony of Georgia as a missionary, and is an absolute failure. He returns home, and his return home, he's on a ship, and there's a storm. Now, I happen to be a guy who loves boating, but I also can get seasick. So these people on the boat, many of them are sick. Wesley is simply scared to death. He's not a big guy. He's just a small, tiny guy, and he's scared. But there's another group of people on the boat that are Christians from Moravia who are singing. And Wesley is taken back by it. It's how can you sing while I'm sitting here shaking like a leaf? The two don't go together for him. And they explain to him, we belong to God. We hope we live. If we do, thanks be to God. If we drown, we still belong to God. Thanks be to God. And while we're alive, we're singing. And Wesley is just bowled over by this. So when the ship arrives safely in London, Wesley decides to seek these people out. So he does. He meets them in Aldersgate. And Aldersgate is, for those of you who have been to London, there's the St. Paul's Cathedral. It's just a couple blocks north of the cathedral. There's the area of Aldersgate. He meets them there, and they are reading from Martin Luther's commentary. And the accent that they are reading is that the just will live by faith, and that God's love is a gift that is given, that needs to be received, has nothing to do with what you do. And Wesley has worked so hard all of his life to please God that when he hears that and when he reads that, the burden of all this work that he's doing falls off of him, and he becomes a different guy. That's where he calls it his heart being strangely warmed, or as clergymen talk about, his holy heartburn. That's Wesley. He then goes back to his group. Now this group being the bunch of students that met. Only some of the students have graduated. There's new students. There's more students. It's a larger group. And the leader of this group is a fellow by the name of George Whitefield. Now a little theology here, not to complicate. The church has always been divided since John Calvin on the word freedom. Wesley is one who points to individual freedom is key. We are a people who are free. Presbyterians, for example, on Calvinism, is the accent is, we have our freedom, but so does the Lord. And the Lord's freedom ultimately reigns. Wesley is on one side, Whitefield is on the other, and this original group, this holy club that outside people call Methodist, half of them are Calvinist and half of them are Arminian. For most of us, I assume we all cheat. We may not be in the academic, but let me give you an example. You are all free people. I mean, you could all get up and leave. But you have the freedom to do that, right? And when you have the freedom to do that, you will accent individual freedom. On the other hand, let me see a raise of hands. How many of you have ever planned something and your plan didn't work out? Anybody? When that happens, you realize that your freedom is one thing, but reality is something else. And for those, some people accent that. Well, these two people, Whitefield and Wesley, are on opposite sides of the fence on that. And they fight over that. Then Whitefield comes to Wesley and says, John, I think the Lord wants me to preach. To travel around England and to preach. And I may even go to the colonies. Why don't you take over the group? You be the leader of this group, this bunch of students from Oxford. And so he does. And they meet in an old cannonball factory called the Foundry. And that's why our building on the other side is called the Foundry, in memory of Wesley's preaching in this foundry. He also says, because they both agree on the church, and their image of the church is kind of interesting. The image of the church is that the only people to go to church in England, for the most part, are society people. And they describe them as society people who go to church to get a little starch and a little ironing. But what everyone really needs is a good bath. That's their image of the church. And so George says to John, why don't you do what I do? Take the gospel to the people wherever they are. So George takes off and heads towards Scotland, and John Wesley then goes to the colonies. And when he goes to the colonies, colony of Georgia, he doesn't go to a church and preach. He goes wherever there are people. He stops in the fields, and the farmers all stop, and he preaches. And then he moves on, goes to another field and preaches, goes to another field and preaches. But he also comes back, and he serves communion, and he preaches. So all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, over a couple of years, there's lots of pockets of people around. Whitefield, on the other hand, is more like a Billy Graham. He goes, and the people that follow Whitefield to go hear him are huge numbers of people. One of the people that loved to hear him was Ben Franklin. Only Ben Franklin was fascinated by the science of it all. In one of his sermons, Franklin walks away with the idea to see how far he can get away from Whitefield and still hear him. And he writes that he was able to get 5 miles. Now, I have a hard time believing that. 5 miles away, and he could still hear Whitefield. But the truth is, Whitefield had crowds of 30,000 people that would come to hear him outside with no mics. He was theatrically trained, and he had one of those voices that carried, and he took over the whole North. Then in one of their debates, as they meet, Whitefield says to Wesley, please stop preaching on this anti-Calvinism. It's harmful to the church. It's divisive. And Whitefield preaches it, Wesley preaches it anyhow and has it published. And people go to Whitefield and they say, tell me, do you think you will see Wesley in heaven? And Whitefield says, no. He said, Wesley will be so close to the throne of God, and I'll be so far away that I doubt that I'll be able to see my friend in heaven. Whitefield then dies in Boston and is buried at a Presbyterian church. But his funeral is held in England. And who does his funeral service? Wesley. And people say, why does Wesley, who has to fight with Whitefield all the time, do his service? Well, the reason was simple. Whitefield had it in his will. When I die, I want my friend John Wesley to preach at my funeral service. Why do I tell you this? I tell you this for a couple reasons. These two gentlemen lived by a couple expressions that were common to Wesley. One was, if your heart be as my heart, give me your hand. Another one was, 1 ounce of love is worth a whole lot more than a pound of knowledge. You and I live in a day and age where Congress is at each other's throats, where people fight and argue and you think they're going to kill each other. And I'm telling you that one of the things that we have learned from Wesley and Whitefield is it does not have to be that way. The second reason that I tell you is that I see it all the time. It's not only with politicians, it's with family members. You do not have to agree with your brother on everything in order to have a solid relationship with your brother. You do not need to agree with your sister 100% to have a working relationship with your sister. You do not have to have 100% agreement with your children to have a relationship with your children. It's not necessary to agree on everything. One of the strengths of the Methodist Church is this. George W. Bush is a Methodist. Hillary Rodham Clinton is a Methodist. They do not agree politically at all. But they can be brothers and sisters in the Church of Christ. And I hope that in your situation, whatever that may be, that you will take the disagreements and understand that an ounce of love is worth a whole lot more than a pound of knowledge. I hope that if someone's heart be as your heart, you can take their hand and walk through life together. Next week, I want to take a look at the American problems. There are 2 of them. And the Wesleys' solution or attempt at a solution to those 2 problems.